My name is Susan Cradle-Murphy. I'm coming to you from down the street at Boston University, where I am the executive director of a program called the INAP, or Impact Management and Allocation Program. We are a research program on campus that is funded through donations from alumni and people in the investment industry who are interested in seeing more academic research published about the impacts of companies on the environment and on society. So trying to bridge that gap of those investors, trying to figure out where to put money with respect to these issues. How do you have really good data to support that? So I'm helping organize a number of projects, research projects on campus with faculty and students, looking from Boston University's very large school with a wide range of departments. And we're working across all those different schools and departments to produce research to help illuminate some of those different issues.
Thank you so much, Susan. Jonathan? Yeah.
Hello everyone. I'm Jonathan Rakoff. I am the head of global policy at the HBAR Foundation Sustainable Impact Fund. We are a Web3 impact VC org essentially, and our mission is to improve ESG disclosure credibility as well as help catalyze the carbon markets, just do a variety of other things. We have a relatively small team, but I've been operating for about a year and made some terrific progress that I think one of my colleagues, the terrific Wes Geisenberger, is talking about right now in the on the other stage. I'm a lawyer by training. I come to the foundation from both a private practice background where I advised primarily tech companies on ESG and climate action, as well as I spent 7 years in the Obama administration at the White House and EPA on climate and environmental policy.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Before that, you just reminded me of background. So just to finish my introduction, I should probably say I'm an engineer by training, and I spent a dozen years consulting for a sustainability consulting firm doing kind of bottom-up calculations, life cycle assessment calculations of products and companies, looking at carbon, water, smog, all sorts of different environmental impacts.
Thank you so much. So to start off with you, Susan, actually with you. How does the current landscape, frameworks, and then the regulatory are helping in carbon-related data disclosures? Can you provide some examples from your research work you're doing? Thanks.
Sure, yeah. So I've been looking at this for a long time now. So I started in that consulting firm back in 2008 and saw initially the clients who were disclosing carbon and calculating on their products were relatively small. And over time, we've seen more and more companies get interested, and now to the point that the financial industry is also really interested in these disclosures and has started up this institute at Boston University, where I am now. So in general, I see more building pressure, even when it's not, we've spoken about before, there's not a lot of formal government mandatory disclosure around carbon, but as more organizations are popping up, there's more peer pressure for disclosure and peer pressure to take action and do something about the carbon emissions we have today. And so we're seeing more being disclosed. And at the same time, part of why this research foundation started is because it feels like the Wild West to a lot of people in it, trying to say there's so many different standards. How do we decide what to do? What can we trust? What do we not trust? How do we do this in a way that's consistent so that every company that I supply to isn't asking me a survey that looks almost the same, but it's not quite the same, so I have to redo the calculations yet again. How do we make this not such a big burden so that we can make progress?
How about you, Jonathan? What do you think?
So I come to that question from a slightly different perspective. As a lawyer in private practice before my time with the HBAR Foundation, I would advise tech companies, in their often in stealth mode. They didn't necessarily want their efforts to be publicized, but they wanted to understand what their climate impacts were and at least begin to understand what they might do to ameliorate them, whether it's through reductions or offset purchases. And what was very common was this fear that if they delved deeply into the sort of the research question, what are my climate impacts, both scope 1, 2, and let alone scope 3, which is supply chain impacts, what might we find? And a great deal of anxiety at the executive and board levels about whether it's even wise or prudent to open that door. And that anxiety has been made, I think, only more acute by the attention that the that ESG has gotten in the last couple of years, and especially with all of there hasn't been a lot of regulatory action so far, but with all the moves in the EU and the US to bring forward standards, there's a pressure on the part of major corporates to know more, to learn more, to talk about what it is that they have learned, but the uncertainties in the carbon data disclosure context have also generated a acute fear of greenwashing litigation risk, enforcement risk. So we have this tension between public pressure, as Susan said, to study these questions and to disclose them, weighed against the fear that if they learn things that would be unpopular and they're forced to disclose them, that would harm them publicly. And if they disclose, especially if they were to announce plans to reduce their emissions or to offset them, and then fail somehow to execute on those plans, they could be subject to various types of liability. And so, that's the landscape that we find ourselves in now.
More evident. Sorry, can you hear me right? So this is a bit more evident with the private and public and emerging data mapping or data disclosures. You see there's a lot of variations, like.
So I personally can't speak as much to developing. Yeah, I've done most of my work in the United States with connections to Europe. But I would say, similar to Jonathan, a lot of my clients, especially back in 2008, 2009, were also in stealth mode. It was, we see this coming. How do we start to develop the understanding so we know what's going on so we can help shape the conversation moving forward? And now, as more disclosures start to come out, I started to work with companies that were not only disclosing, but then two companies in a small industry decided to disclose the carbon impact of the products that they produce. Then the third company would call us and say, okay, if they're both disclosing this, I guess I need to disclose it now too. So how do we do this? Exactly. There's peer pressure that as more disclosures are happening, more peers in the group are feeling they need to disclose as well. And so there is that challenge of how do you disclose with confidence, because you don't want to accidentally disclose something that was calculated incorrectly, because a lot of these calculations are still pretty new and there's a lot of uncertainty. And so how do you properly disclose the fact that these numbers are not a precise single value, but there is some uncertainty around?
Susan, we know that there's so many technologies in place right now, AI, ML, NLP, and we also have geospatial time. Do you think to improve the data quality on the current technology, or do you think there's more innovation needed? And GPT is coming out, right? It's disruptive. So do you think something like that will be more needed to get into the next level of disclosures? Apart from the regulatory and all that stuff with the technology.
Yeah, I think it's this is a big interdisciplinary problem, right? There's not any one silver bullet. It's not going to be one piece of technology or one policy or one law or whatever it is that's going to solve this. But I think all of it needs to be progressing together. And I know we talked about before, one of the, not a new technology, but just even the satellite data you can see on Google Maps. One of the researchers over at Boston University has been looking at what's happening in Indonesia over time, where they're looking at the maps and the deforestation. And in Indonesia is where a lot of the palm oil is grown. And palm oil is in a large percentage of consumer products that you purchase either for food or cosmetics or other things use palm oil. And how do you know that it's being sourced responsibly? How do you know which suppliers are following the rules around deforestation, slash and burn, or not? And so they're starting to find ways to use some technologies that already exist to just deploy them more effectively and say, okay, well, if we look at this data over time, how do we see which areas are being newly deforested that had signed on saying there was going to be no more deforestation in this area, and which ones are not? Can we map that to the names of the suppliers in that area and then track, kind of fill out the supply chain to see who's following the rules and who's not as this kind of third-party check? Because so much of what's happening around carbon disclosures right now is self-reported. So it's a company saying, I've done my best to do these calculations. Here's what I think is happening in my supply chain. And so we're trying to use different technologies, some new, some old, and just finding ways to deploy them to have those third-party verification options.
So,
from legal point of view.
So I guess I'll comment on both. So on the point about technology, So at the HBR Foundation Sustainable Impact Fund, this is exactly what we're doing. We're investing behind companies using developments in distributed ledger technology, in our case on Hedera, to find ways to improve the transparency and auditability of ESG data when it's disclosed. If it's disclosed in a manner that lands it on a public blockchain, it's immutably recorded. These are all things that tend to improve credibility and reduce resistance to disclosure. But I would emphasize what Susan said. This is a multifactorial problem, right? And so, it doesn't necessarily help a major corporate trying to decide whether or not they're going to develop information about their climate impacts and disclose them, to propose the use of a brand new technology that in the US context, for example, is now under heavy regulatory scrutiny and pressure, right? Perhaps not always well-founded scrutiny and pressure. There's a lot of educational work that the Web3 industry needs to do, especially in the States, to help our regulators understand the difference between a Web3 tool for climate disclosure and a meme coin, for example. But it is important to increase the education that folks in positions of policymaking authority have, while at the same time encouraging those entities to provide guidance to the major corporates and others out there. Because what you'll find, what I've found, is that in response, for example, to the SEC's proposed rule for climate disclosure, tons of corporate pushback. But what you'll often hear privately is a desire for some rules to be passed so that everyone's on a level playing field, right? And you don't have to undertake the risk of a choice to disclose, which then may lead to greenwashing litigation or enforcement risk.
Yeah. I think that the cherry picking is where the greenwashing is more evident, right? I mean, you pick and choose which data you want to disclose, which you think there's no data available, but there's no effort put in, how do you get the data, at least in your estimation figures. So do you think there's going to be a bit more rampant, or do you think it's going to be more toned down with these technologies? Do you think they're going to trace to that extent?
I don't know. I think greenwashing will continue to be there, because it's just a challenging new area that is fairly new.
But the challenge, I think, is going to help.
And so I think all the greenwashing that happened is not malicious, is the other thing that's happening too, right? There are companies that are doing their best with a small budget to make the best estimations they can and disclose. Yeah. And then they may learn in another couple of years, as better data about their supply chain becomes available, that they maybe misestimated what was happening in their supply chain. And it could be in a helpful direction, or it could be in the reverse direction. They could be like, oh no, we thought this was so much better than it was. Our carbon impact is actually worse than we thought. Or it's much better than we thought. And I've seen that happen to companies as well. They're like, oh, well, we assumed this was, had whatever,
I think the baseline figures are a bit competitive to get hold of, right?
Yeah. So that's one of the things that I think is tricky about this field right now, is because of the uncertainty around a lot of the numbers, particularly in scope 3. Scope 1 and 2, meaning the things you own, the emissions coming out of your own facilities. That's much easier to measure because you physically own it. It's the supply chain has a lot more estimations, because global supply chains are very complex and it's hard to get all of the details accurately all the way through. And so I think that's where we have to just take a lot of these numbers with a little bit of a grain of salt as the market is maturing, and understand that there will be errors that need to be corrected. And we heard a little bit of that in the last presentation as well, is how do we correct things when we learn and realize that we weren't fully accurate the last time, and not be overly punishing to those who were willing to take a stand and make a disclosure and say the best that they thought to be true. If there was a mistake because we're doing new things, that's okay, and we want to encourage disclosure, even though it may not be fully precise yet.
I think those are really important points. And, it's also, I think, critical to recognize that the state of the art is changing extraordinarily fast in this space, right? And so, if you are a well-meaning company, with small or large, and you invest time and energy in estimates of your impact, or in a plan for action, and then 6, 8, 12 months later, suddenly the kind of resolution that that the industry is capable of generating, the detail that is now available, suddenly makes your estimate look sloppy.
The comparison.
Exactly. It's important not to penalize those companies, and those, especially the sustainability officers in those companies who are probably spending political capital to get those estimates done, simply because we now have higher expectations.
Yeah, and an example I can give related to that is in my consulting work, I did a lot of work in the green building industry. And there's the LEED standard that some of you may be familiar with that decides whether or not a building is up to a certain environmental level and it could get silver, gold, platinum status. And when LEED version 4 came out, probably 5-6 years ago now, what it did was it said you could have, if you built your building using products that had environmental declarations attached to them, meaning you disclose what is the carbon impact, what's the water impact, energy impact, etc. of this product, then you would be eligible for more points regardless of what the numbers were. And I think that was a really important step. As I said, we don't care what the numbers are. You could say this product has a horribly high carbon impact, but at least you told us what it is to encourage more disclosure so that more companies would get practice doing this and the numbers get out there. And then hopefully over time, there's natural pressure with public disclosures to improve them. But, not penalizing initial disclosures to just get it out.
Divestment as well, unless it's so severe, you shouldn't be divesting away because everyone has a role to play within this to put net zero. So I agree with that. Not penalizing is not all. Yeah. Cool. So the next point is to discuss on how do you actually measure and estimate assumptions on the carbon data. I mean, we just discussed this, right? I mean, the assumptions could be cherry picking, or could be like a peer group analysis, or it could be, you're looking at the company spending habits. I mean, there's no clarity over here. I mean, there's so many frameworks and voluntary, you have a mandatory, you have a regulatory, but none of them are really beating up to the mark, actually. What do you think from your experience should be the best practice for estimating assumptions in the carbon data, nearest figures? That's the challenge. And then what technologies are also playing an important role in getting the right data, especially for the carbon?
Yeah, I think this is where my personal view is that there's not a one-size-fits-all answer for every industry. And I think depending on what it is you make and, you sell, the way you go about your estimation is going to be different. Some companies are, if you're more of a software-oriented thing, most of your impact's coming from the electricity you buy, and you can focus on that. If you are manufacturing physical goods, depending on what sorts of materials you're using, there may be certain areas that are most material. And then maybe you have a handful that you can do a really detailed dive to understand, these are the 5 materials I use a lot of. I really want to understand the details of my supply chain around these 5 materials. Or you may have, 200 materials you're working with, and maybe you need to focus on, there's a lot of advice out there that says it's a combination of what you use the most of, but also if you're using platinum or you're using some precious metal, that maybe you have a small quantity, but that has a big impact. So I think different industries need to figure out what's material to their disclosure, and will have different focuses as they work on their initial carbon reporting. And there's a number, as you said, there's a number of different organizations out there suggesting what's most material to which industry. But I think those industry working groups are really important for solving a lot of these issues, so that there's alignment within industries, I think, is where we'll get to first before we have alignment across all industries.
So I agree with all of that. I mean, it's incredibly important to get industry specificity where the industry merits it. Not every industry will require it. What you've seen in recent years is the emergence of a number of different software as a service. Exactly, you have organizations like Persephone and Watershed that and many others, not to leave anyone out, that are making it possible for companies without the resources to hire a McKinsey or a Bain to go granular and sort of go into their details, micro level, super particularity, to actually do estimates through spend-based algorithmic measurements. They have a dashboard. You calculate, you sort of provide these inputs. What's your marketing spend? How many physical facilities you have? What's your electricity consumption? And they'll generate pretty efficiently with a fairly high degree of accuracy, but they're estimates of what the carbon impact or the carbon emissions are of that company for scope 1, 2, and then they do some scope 3 work. But these estimates do have limitations, and if you allow those limitations to be to foreclose the use of these services, then suddenly you exclude a large number of companies that would otherwise not measure at all, right? What's the other solution? The other solution is to go deep in the weeds, the way Susan may have in her consulting practice, but that can be exceptionally expensive, right? It's either an estimate-based approach or you're measuring ground up. So one of the things that we're doing at the HBAR Foundation is investing in tools that make measurement from the ground up easier. For example, if you can embed, so you have software companies like Susan mentioned that have primarily electricity consumption, some office-based impacts, but for the most part, it's their data service providers and the scope 2, a little bit of scope and scope 3. But if you're Amazon and you have physical packages that go from place to place, it's immensely more complex. So if we can embed sensors in all of those packages and all of the trucks and so forth and planes, you might get good supply chain data about their operations. Exactly. The problem is it will never be perfect, and it will be exceptionally costly to get each additional increment of improvement. And so, there's a question for the industry: which direction will we go?
Last question before we go to the audience, open up a panel. How do you improve the data quality with the current technologies? And do you think there will be like invention of any high-level technologies that to improve the data quality?
Sure. So what I'm focused on at Boston University is improving data quality through more transparency of the data. All right. So it's a combination of projects, like I mentioned, of the geosensing one, looking at satellite data of deforestation. We have projects looking at what's really happening with some of the standards that do exist. We have some people on the accounting team looking at the SASB recommendations as to what climate risks should be disclosed in the 401k section, your 401k to the SEC, and versus what's actually happening. So after many years of SASB saying for certain industries, here's what you ought to disclose, what's the Venn diagram there of, is there overlap of what's actually being disclosed in certain industries with what SASB is recommending should be disclosed or not? Are they disclosing something different related to climate than what was predicted for the industry, and why? So we're looking at those sorts of things. We have a really big project looking at future corporate carbon emissions and reduction statements. So as companies are saying in a future year they're going to reduce their carbon emissions to a certain level, we're looking at how that's changing over time. So when they set their goal for 2025 back in 2015, and then they updated it in 2020, and now in 2023, is it still the same number? Is it moving up or down? How are those future targets either staying the same or moving up or down, and why? And then what other actions can we see? We're trying to pull together information on, especially for large manufacturing, the utility industry, where they have big, building big solar plants, decommissioning old coal plants. Those projects take time. And so you can see in other public disclosures from the company, are these projects still on track? Are they being ahead of schedule? Are they behind schedule? How will that impact our understanding of the risk of achieving that 2025 or 2030 carbon target? Will they get there or not based on the other things we can see happening around? So on the university level, we're really looking for research trying to pull together data that's out there in the public, but not compiled yet in a way that's easy to be used to bring more transparency and just encourage use and understanding of better quality data, bringing it into the puzzle.
So I think data quality is our mission too, with respect to climate and other types of sustainability data, water use efficiency data and others. It depends a bit on which data sets you're talking about. So, as Susan said, if you're talking about a forestry project and the
biodiversity or
so in the case of a forestry project, for example, folks are planting trees, and we want to know with some reliability those trees haven't been cut down or they're not burning down, that they're growing with the rate that had been predicted. And one of the ways to do that that will improve the timeliness of the data is to use satellite data and to embed sensors in those forests and have the data streamed in real time to a public blockchain where it is available for everyone to see, to view, exactly, recorded in a transparent and immutable way. But you also get benefits in the corporate disclosure context because as at least historically, whether it's climate data or other sustainability data, it is reported once a year, and it's always retrospective. And there's usually a small number of fallible human beings who are going through corporate books and trying to gather and compile that data. We don't have enough time, given the urgency of the climate challenge that we face, for once a year corporate reporting to be enough. And so, the hope is that, we can assist companies using Web3 tech to automate some of their data streams, have those data sets put up on Ledger in a rather continuous way that allows the community to view and to vet them, and where mistakes are made, and there will be mistakes. We don't have to wait a full year. Right? One of the challenges, I think, is if you discover mistakes and they have been long-running mistakes, there is a natural human tendency to assume bad motives. But if you catch the mistake an hour after it was posted and 2 days later you've corrected it, I think most people will give you a pass, right? And so it's the data quality, but also the timeliness of the disclosure and correction.
So before we go to audience again, do you have any best practices what to share? Practices from the arts, as Jonathan from the arts within the cell. Finally.
Say more. Best practices as to
disclose this. Industry players, yeah.
So, I will be speaking slightly beyond my capability, but I think the conventional wisdom in a corporate context, which I'm not currently in, would be to, if you want to build a sustainability department that has good ESG performance, you need to have the ESG built into the corporate governance of the company. So you have, people who's strong governance. You have people who have assigned roles, supported by management. Ideally, it's written into the corporate foundation documents, such that there's not a struggle within a company to justify disclosures that a chief sustainability officer, for example, might want to make. So if such a person, if she decides to discover what your scope 3 is, even if it's only partial scope 3. We want that person to be empowered internally. So best practice would be to have defined roles in a company and established reporting channels, and to announce to the public what you're going to report before the data has been generated internally. So there isn't an internal struggle about whether or not it's too damaging to disclose.
Yeah. Building off of that, I would say internally, I think it's important to make sure that throughout the organization, anyone who's making decisions about purchasing, whether it's electricity or products, understands that these reports are being compiled. So they're not just thinking about the dollar sign of how much does it cost me to buy these different things. And, we all know how to roll that up into the financial statements of a company. But if a company is now also reporting on carbon impacts or water or any of a number of other environmental issues, make sure the decision makers understand that and have the data around the assumptions that are, even whether you have granular data about the materials they're purchasing or you're making assumptions about them, let them know so that your team can help you and is not just an accountant at the end of the day summing up the decisions that were made, but as the decisions are being made, let people help drive towards decarbonization in their choices.
I would also mention there is a technology element to best practices, and the tools that the HBR Foundation Sustainable Impact Fund is working on developing with our partners might not yet be mature enough to be technology standards, but the model I think ultimately should be something like you see in a lot of U.S. environmental laws. You look for best available control technologies, right? And so in the ESG disclosure context, we may hopefully quickly get to a point where there are tools for ESG disclosure, whether it is public blockchains or all the interesting related digital infrastructure tools like AI, machine learning, remote sensing, that we can agree as a community should be used, assuming that they're appropriate to the industry context. Basically rebuttable presumption that, best and most reliable tools, used for that context, and that reduces the challenge for adoption in a corporate context.
What do you fund? You need a mic. Yeah.
ESG management and reporting tools. And so my question is for Jonathan. I'm curious, in the work that you've done consulting tech companies, how do they think about investing in specifically carbon emission reductions? And what's that conversation like? And are they investing at all or thinking about investing in supply chain reductions to reduce their Scope 3 footprint?
So really good question. I think my answer will be burdened a bit by the fact that the clients that I represented were, most recently 2021, 2020, before I joined the HBR Foundation, and the world is a very different place now than it was then. Back then, it was really all about whether a company would, invest the, 50 to 250,000 in the software as a service dashboards and tools to calculate their emissions, a capability that they just didn't have unless they knew about Susan's operation, or they were willing to pay agree to more, I assume, for a McKinsey or a Bain or a BCG. And so it really was all about that. It was all about the tool to get those estimates surfaced in some sort of reliable way, intelligible to management, and configured in a way that you could then report them to CDP, for example. I think the landscape now is moving towards, a company might have a very complicated value chain. They may be moving physical goods from point A to point B. You may have the ability to embed, like one of our investee partners, Atma AO through AV Dennison, embed RFID trackers into all of the into their products, see where they move throughout the world, post all of that data, on Ledger through the kinds of tools that we're developing. You could invest in those sorts of capabilities and really get a great deal of granular understanding of what your supply chain and related emissions might look like. But I think the most honest answer is, stay tuned 6 to 12 months, because the repertoire of possible tools that a company could invest in will be a great deal more robust, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you both so much. I think my question is a little more for Susan, also great last name. My understanding, so we work a lot with supply chains, with companies who are they're not really large companies, right? So doing sustainable activities are sort of like core to their value prop to their buyers or customers. But I'm curious about some of the bigger companies it sounds like you might have worked with this question. You sort of raised the point that transparency is probably a one-way street. Like, we're probably not going to look back in 5 years and be like, oh, we should now be less transparent, right? So we just have to start disclosing, and even those things you talked about where there might be mistakes, we need to disclose the mistakes, we need to disclose the shortcomings. But what is the conversation like with some of these larger entities where ostensibly some of them are first movers, I guess, in doing this? And, so I'm assuming there's hesitance there, but how do you incentivize them to do that? What's in it for them, I guess?
I'd say for some of the first movers, it's a point of pride that they see themselves as first movers and leaders in their industry, and they want to continue to be first movers. So that I think is part of the identity of some companies is, we are the best, we are the first movers, we will lead the industry, and they want to continue to do that. And for a number of those, I think the way in which they did that was still, as Jonathan mentioned as well, is kind of secretly for a little while, where they first, if they're largely, I'm thinking of the bigger companies, not the startups that are trying to make difference, but the more established, larger corporations, Well, first internally, take a few years to try to do the calculations, really do as deep of a dive as they can to figure things out before they start publicly publishing many of these numbers, because they want to see a little bit of that over time. How did this year's numbers compare to last year's numbers before they disclose? And then once they do it, then some of the other followers in the industry perhaps don't have as long to catch up. But in my experience, my observation was it was mostly a point of pride and mission of the company that they want to continue to be seen as first movers and see this as an important issue that they want to be a leader in.
Thanks. This question is for you, Jonathan. You talked about forestry sort of methods of data collection, observation, etc. There are a number of environmental initiatives that don't look at carbon as necessarily the primary indicator of success. Case in point, the redwood reclamation projects, where they are actually taking new growth forests and actually cutting down trees in that new growth forest in order to stimulate a more similar environment to old growth forests, in that plantings are happening in a staggered way rather than necessarily all at once, and so all the trees are the same age. And what do you sort of see in the emerging ESG models and data disclosure models that are trying to tackle this sort of intention rather than a sort of carbon maximalist mindset as far as what the purpose or outcome or value of a project might be?
So great question. My colleagues from my EPA days will talk about those kinds of complexities in a much less polite way than you just have, with great frustration, right? I'm probably as the lawyer in that group, sitting back and nodding more than equipped to go into the weeds and render some view about when a methodology for environmental benefit is good or bad. But what I think you're getting at is there will be multiple different methodologies for calculating environmental benefit, and those environmental benefits will not necessarily all be the same categorically. And what is, I think, super important for us to do is find a way to compare these environmental methodologies digitally, apples to apples, to the extent that we can. So one of our partners, Envision Blockchain, we've funded them to build what we've called our Guardian solution, and it does a number of different things. It's a code base that, in this context, enables the methodologies for environmental benefits to be uploaded and compared digitally, so that you can, in a way that I'm sure I could be more eloquent in describing, but in its most kind of high altitude basic sense, you can see the percentage difference between the methodologies. You can see important relevant distinctions like this. Methodology A is focused on carbon, and methodology B is focused on some co-benefit, and carbon actually is the subsidiary benefit, right? And so once we have some common agreed method to view all of these methodologies side by side, you can select the correct methodology for the correct project, and at least avoid the kinds of confusion that I think you're pointing to. I'm not aware that any of the ESG disclosure frameworks that whether it's the legacy SASB or whatever the GRA or whatever the successor framework is going to be, the ISSB, I guess, is working on a
project, mapping the questions, the mandatory questions, and then that's the best way to. It saves the time, and then also you're getting all of it. Just of all of the frameworks. So I think that's a better way. It's a more efficient way to mapping.
I think the point is that these ESG disclosure frameworks don't yet have the sophistication that you would need to be able to make the kinds of distinctions that you're referring to.
So in that context of your answer, there has been a lot of talk in this room around sort of how carbon credits can be used as sort of a foundational valuation factor, like something that can potentially be normalized across different projects, et cetera, and used in direct correlation with funding models. Do you see a problem with sort of the focus on carbon credits being that kind of directly tied to that funding model, being more easily discovered from a price or value perspective versus some of these more, as the gentleman from Ripple said, kind of a vintage, more NFT kind of nuanced aspect that's not necessarily, like you could say the Redwood project is potentially more ecologically beneficial, even though it has less carbon impact. But in the context of a lot of what's being discussed today, if you were to put it up into a carbon market or some sort of Web3 market that was valuing that sort of stuff, it'd be much easier for people to look at it through the lens of what is the carbon impact, and much harder to do price discovery or value discovery to properly account for the value impact for those more nuanced elements.
Sure. So that's an incredibly important point. It is not, I think, the case that as we stand here today, there are perfect solutions. What we're really getting at is that, carbon credits are understood to be, especially in the kind of corporate buyer context, as, sort of fungible commodities, right? They're all, it's one credit represents 1 metric ton of carbon removed, carbon equivalent. But the reality is that, these carbon credits reflect environmental projects that are different and that have different attributes, right? And so you might have a carbon credit emerging from a forestry project that doesn't have the kinds of controls to prevent reversals, fire, future harvesting of the new stands, whatever, that you might like to see. Or you might look at a credit that is arising from a direct air capture project where you have, the credits may be expensive, but once that carbon is mineralized, it's done, it's out, right? There's no real legitimate reversal concern. And so one of the ways that we've attempted to deal with this is to invest in technology that would use machine learning to surface all of the attributes. So if we can tokenize the credits, we can build into those tokens all of the roles and actors associated with underlying projects. Basically, you have all the metadata that reflects the project beneath. Imagine buying a house, right? I mean, no one buys a house as if it's a commodity. You actually look at Zillow and you see how many bedrooms it has, and you see how many bathrooms it has, and you do a title check to make sure there aren't any encumbrances. We need that level of granularity, and to the extent that we can surface those attributes. Using, for example, a automatic regression market maker tool that one of our partners has been developing with us, we can price the credits differently depending on the underlying attributes. That's the only way that I'm aware of kind of dealing with those problems. There may be other ways, though.
Add one other thought to that. Social equity and social justice issues is the other thing that we are looking a lot into in some of the research projects, not just within the IMAP program I'm part of, but within Boston University, my parent organization, the Institute for Global Sustainability set of research is, not, like you said, not all carbon credits are equal, right? Some have different additional environmental pros or cons. And then when you bring the human element into it in terms of where is this, which neighborhood gets the project, there's a whole lot of other social pieces to it that we want to take into consideration as well. And that's going to be a challenge for the technology moving forward as well, is how do we keep that in the mix? Question 5.
Somewhat related question to what you were just talking about. So I work with smallholder projects around the world that organize has kind of like local coalitions, but they're mostly creating local markets. So like micro circular economies. And a big question we have at this moment is like, is it worth it to us to try to dock with ESG funding? Or is that scale of small projects that have this capacity hurdle to like accessing measurements and satellite data and so forth, combined with they're not really part of the industrial landscape of supply chains? Is there any place for them in the ESG landscape? Are you aware of that at all?
I'm not fully aware, honestly, in terms of how that works. To my mind, the main thing I think about related to your question is ESG is not one thing. And the way I like to think about it, before we talked about ESG, there was socially responsible investing. There's been other names for this concept of thinking beyond the dollar signs, but thinking about the other elements. And so for different people, ESG can mean different things, but I would like to think in general, this movement towards more financial institutions and investors caring about and wanting to see more information around the environmental and social impacts would only be beneficial. So I'd like to think there's a link for you, but I'm afraid I'm not the right person to offer specifics. I don't know if you have any more to add.
Something I can help you, maybe you can catch up with the networking at the lunchtime. Yeah, I do a lot of ESG work, so I can help you.
Perfect. There you go.
Yeah. Any more questions, or we're happy to wrap up? And thanks everyone for coming. Great.